Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 29th edition of Stay at Home. Stay at Home is a video political education series from Jacobin magazine. Throughout this quarantine for the last 30 plus days, we've been joined almost every night at 6 p.m. with a left-wing thinker who's been doing a presentation for around 30 minutes, and then we've been doing a Q&A afterwards. So if you want to participate in that Q&A, all you need to do is log into YouTube and leave a question for us in the chat box. This is a project we're not asking for any money for. We're not really soliciting a big donation drive around it. It's not limited to just Jacobin subscribers. We're not even making you log into a Zoom call so we can harvest your email for future uses. All we are doing is asking you to press like and subscribe on the feed. Now, what that does is just allows these videos to reach a bigger and bigger audience because more people get served it through the YouTube algorithm. So please do that. Press like, press subscribe, tell your friends about it on social media, and that's it. So tonight I have the great pleasure of being joined by Leo Panitch. Now, Leo's been a long-time Jacobin contributor, really a mentor to the project and to many of us involved. Especially when Jacobin was starting off, we had a very small audience. We had a set of ideas. We had certain people that we were engaged with and we looked up to, and we really drew a lot of our own thought from and engaged and debated with them. And Leo was first and foremost among them. Sam Gindin, the list goes on, but a lot of them were in this milieu around the Socialist Register. And the Socialist Register was a publication that was co-founded by Ralph Miliband, I believe, in 1964. And since then, it's been publishing on an annual basis continuously. Leo Panitch today, our guest, is one of the co-editors of Socialist Register. He's also the author of some really important books. Some of the recent ones are The Making of Global Capitalism with Sam Gindin, also The Socialist Challenge Today, also co-written. And he's the author of a forthcoming book. The title of it is Searching for Socialism, the project of the labor new left from Ben to Corbyn with Colin Lees. And this is something I'm looking forward to. I think it's coming out with Verso next month. So please do check that out on the Verso site. I'm sure we're going to have a link to it in the description. This is not a great time to have a book released. We have a lot of great titles coming out, and people have a lot of spare time, but unfortunately, you can't go into any bookstores anymore. So please do support Leo and give that a read. And also check out Socialist Register, which again is an annual that is really without comparison. If I had to pick, besides for Jacobin, Catalyst, and Tribune, another left-wing publication that you should be reading, it would be Socialist Register. So he's going to talk today about the work of his longtime collaborator, Ralph Miliband. Now, Miliband's work might be best known among socialists in the US for State in Capitalist Society, his examination of his contribution to Marxist state theory. A lot of DSAers I know are also been lately reading Marxism in Politics. My own kind of early bit of high school political education was through his last book, Socialism for a Skeptical Age, which is somewhat more uneven than his other work, but I think a very good broad look at what was still relevant and what wasn't in the traditional socialist worldview. And that was written in the 90s. So this is his last book. I think Miliband's thought is extremely important for those of us trying to carve out a radical tradition, a Marxism that doesn't capitulate to the right to social democracy, but also questions some of the orthodoxies of traditional Leninism. And Ralph Miliband walked this tightrope very, very well. He was always committed to radical emancipation, and he never fell trap to the rightward movements of the British left. So at a time when a lot of his collaborators, a lot of people that were formerly on his part of the left, began to write things that paved in part the intellectual foundations for New Labor. Miliband never wavered. He has a great New Left Review article from the 1980s called "Against the New Revisionism," as he put it, in Britain. And Leo and others are really continuing this tradition today. I like to think that Jacobin is trying to fill that political space as well. Without further ado, let me pass it off to Leo, who's going to chat for around 30 minutes. He's going to give a lecture covering some of the key points of the political thought of Ralph Miliband. Then afterwards, we're going to have a discussion. So log in, put your questions in the Q&A, and please, in the meantime, press like, press subscribe, share the video with your friends. And without further ado, why don't you take it away, Leo?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Bhaskar. And I must say, deciding to focus on Ralph Miliband's work today amidst this pandemic, with our eyes glued as we sit in isolation to what the state will do to allow human society to continue to function. It's remarkable that we should go back to the person who produced the state and capitalist society during this pandemic, because it is so relevant. The opening words, here's my very old, marked up, torn copy way back from 1969 with his inscription to me. And the very opening sentences just ring true today. More than ever, men now live in the shadow of the state. What they want to achieve, individually or in groups, now mainly depends on the state's sanction and support. But since that sanction and support is not bestowed indiscriminately, they must ever more directly seek to influence and shape the state's power and purpose, or try to appropriate it altogether. There's a second reason, but one related to this, why it's very important, I think, for us to go back and look at Miliband's work. And that is that this pandemic, this moment, is taking place in the wake of some 5, 6, 7 years of a revival of interest, especially amongst a young generation on the left, who have radical anti-capitalist inclinations, a revival of their part of interest in the necessity of using the electoral democratic means available to get into the state with a view to changing it in some fashion. Many of them, most of them, you might even say, astonishingly enough, articulate that, as Miliband did throughout his life, in explicit democratic socialist terms. So the question then becomes, how can we use this time in isolation to look at what a book like The State and Capitalist Society can tell us, and especially can tell this new conjuncture, about reinforcing the necessity for getting into the state, and yet understanding the enormity of the task. Understanding what Miliband's great teacher, Harold Lasky, once said, that dedicating oneself to getting beyond the existing state to a fundamental new society is the most hazardous task a person can undertake. I'll talk a bit about the state and capitalist society, but then I want to go on to talk, and Bhaskar is referring to this, To Miliband's other work, his other thinking, his strategic orientation towards the question of what type of movements and what type of parties who have socialism as their ambition are necessary to get into the state and actually transform it in a way that could bring us beyond it being a capitalist state. And in that sense, his work was, and his own commitment was, I think, the most sustained of any intellectual in the second half of the 20th century, as Bashkar was saying, right through the disenchantment with socialism that was so common in intellectual circles in the last 20 years of the 20th century. So suspicious of grand narratives, whereas Miliband always took it as his most basic principle that life was not worth living unless one dedicated oneself to such a grand cause, that life was small and meaningless unless one did so. Well, I, as a 22-year-old from Winnipeg in Canada, expecting that I had won a Commonwealth scholarship because I did well as an undergraduate, and it could take me to swinging London for a year, expecting that I would go and do a master's degree there and then come back and go to law school, was stuck in an extremely boring public administration master's program. The reason I was put there was that I had said I was interested in economic planning. And I was tearing my hair out listening to these incredibly boring lectures when I met a fellow Canadian who'd been around for a while, and he said, "You must come up to the 5th floor and hear this guy Milliband," which I did. And what I stumbled into was the lectures that composed the State and Capitalist Society. And Milliband wasn't lecturing on Marx or on Lenin, he was lecturing on de Gaulle memoirs and what they had to show us about the state being a state and a capitalist society. Later in his life, he was to do the same with a very close reading of Robert Caro's biography of Lyndon Johnson. And that showed you what type of an intellectual he was. Not primarily interested in cloistered debates within the Marxist canon, although absolutely committed to using Marxism as a tool to attempt to develop an adequate political understanding, an adequate political theorization of the world we live in, and above all, the political dimensions of that world, where it was generally agreed Marxism had always been weakest. In terms of its class analysis, one could say it is one of the founding disciplines of sociology. Obviously, in terms of Marx's economic analysis, it is one of the great contributions to economics. What was happening at the time that Miliband published The State and Capitalist Society was a common development on the part of people who were in the Marxist tradition of a recognition of how barren the toolbox was to understand politics, both parties and the state, in the Marxist canon. And when Miliband published The State and Capitalist Society in 1969, one of his first footnotes was a book has just been published in Paris by Nikos Poulantzas, Political Power and Social Classes, which arrived on my desk just after I had sent off this manuscript to my publisher. He only managed to get in a footnote. Similarly, at the same time, there was a group of German scholars, now most famously known to have cloistered around Klaus Offe, who were attempting to use Marxist economics and deriving a theory of politics, a theory of the state, from the theories of surplus value and accumulation. In the United States, James O'Connor, founding himself on that attempt, would produce one of the most important books to understand the crisis of the 70s and the evolution of neoliberalism, the fiscal crisis of the state, which I would urge people to read. Miliband's book was, however, distinctive. Someone who picked it up did not have to have already been cloistered in Marxist debates and Marxist concepts. It was explicitly designed to provide people who weren't initiated with a means of understanding the political world in which they live. A lot of Marxists, therefore, called it pre-theoretical because it didn't immediately enter into the debates with other Marxists on how to conceptualize the state, but rather it entered into debates with the received wisdom, the wisdom of pluralism, of elite theory, of the very notion that, yes, at one time, the states we live in had been capitalist. At one time, they had been dominated by a capitalist ruling class. But ever since the post-war era, and this was the view that was articulated most clearly by Anthony Crosland, the guru, the intellectual doyen of post-war social democracy, not only in Britain, but you could say more broadly. He had said anyone who didn't think Marx was relevant in the 1930s was a mental pygmy. I think he said a mental dwarf. I once got in trouble for quoting him for using a derogatory term for short people. So please forgive me if I quote him again. And the reason he gave for that in the 1950s was that it was no longer relevant because three things had fundamentally changed. A true balance of power had emerged between capital and labor. The state had become independent of the capitalist class, and the capitalist class itself was no longer dominated by finance. This was the intellectual guru of social democracy in the 1950s. So Milliband, who conceived the state and capitalist society in 1962, was in a sense responding to that predominant view. And I must say, those people who look back today to social democracy of the post-war era as where we want to get to will be among the people who will be most rewarded, I think, from reading the state and capitalist society today, because you will see that the analysis he undertakes of the way in which even the interventionist post-war state remained in its pores, in its structures, in its objectives, capitalist, left it open to precisely the kind of contradictions that gave rise to neoliberalism. What this book, above all, does for us in that sense is it takes us past the sterile debate that we have been so trapped in, and that I'm afraid we might fall into again in the wake of the obvious necessity for state planning and state provision in the wake of this pandemic. The entirely superficial dichotomy between state and market. What Miliband State and Capitalist Society shows is that the state benefits, the state provisions were still fundamentally intertwined with what he called private purpose, the requirements of accumulation, and the reproduction of a class structure in which there remained the dominant class and subordinate classes. It was always an illusion to think that neoliberalism involved less state. It never involved less state. It involved a state that was extremely active in order to facilitate the marketization of larger and larger spheres of public life and even of state services. In that sense, it made some sense to speak of state and market. We've got to be very careful now that we don't return to a situation in which we reinvest in the type of state behavior that will limit markets, but do so in a way that leaves us open again to the same contradiction between private purpose and social necessity that Miliband was identifying in the state and capitalist society. Okay. What was especially distinctive and important in the way Miliband went about constructing the state and capitalist society was to take the institutions of the capitalist state seriously. Poulantzas's theorization was founded on using Marxist class theory to try to see the state as a field of class struggle, which is by no means incorrect. But in terms of analyzing the specificity of state institutions, one already had to be somewhat an inducted Marxist theorist to be able to read and appreciate, not only in the original French, but even in the very good English translations, what Poulantzas was getting at. And as I indicated before, people like Offa and O'Connor were deriving the nature of the capitalist state from the economic concepts of Marxism. Miliband was trying to develop a conceptual framework for understanding the capitalist state at the political level. And in taking state institutions seriously, he began with the rather obvious point, which I think far too many people who have the ambition of electing socialists to government fully appreciate. And that is that the state is a complex of institutions, a state system with a complex of institutions within it, in which government is only one element. And when you were elected to government office, you're not invested with state power insofar as the full complex of institutions remains unaltered. That's the first point that he made. And then he went on to examine the framework of that system in a much broader institutional way. The bureaucracy, the people who populate it, what he called the servants of the state, the judiciary, the security, intelligence, and military apparatus, the judiciary, and then those spheres that were functionally attached to the state, but were constitutionally, at least in a capitalist democracy, as opposed to a fascist capitalist state, were effectively independent of the state while being closely attached to it. That is, the religious institutions, the media, and so on. The universities, intellectual apparatuses in general. The essence of Miliband's argument, in the little time I'll have to talk about it, and I urge you to pick up a copy of the book and read it. If you can't get the original back in '69, Merlin republished it in 2009. I was just looking back, Merlin Press, that is, and I was just looking back at my introduction to that, and it begins with this sentence: Barack Obama is putting the state in charge of the economy in the land of free enterprise, is the front page headline that greets me as I sit down to write. And I was trying to point out to people then the importance of reading the state and capitalist society in the context of the massive intervention by the state in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, and in the context of the hopes that had been invested in Obama at that time. Miliband's essential argument was that it's not an economic elite that dominates the state through telling them what to do. Those who thought he had an instrumentalist conception of the state, whereby the heads of the corporations and the banks who had a common point of view with regard to this or that state policy would ring up a prime minister or a state bureaucrat every morning and tell him what to do. That was, of course, absurd. And he, in that sense, was implicitly criticizing Marxism for some formulations which gave that impression. On the contrary, what he was trying to articulate was the relationship between what was a dominant class, to show that it wasn't an economic elite, but a dominant class, and a dominant class that was in partnership with the servants of the state and with the state elite, if you like, with the key figures in the state. A partnership which was cemented by a common set of values. And those values centered around, by the time of the late 1960s, a broad consensus view that the world we lived in was the best of all possible worlds, which social democratic governments, labor governments, most trade union leaders had come to share. Beyond that, the servants of the state, the bureaucracy, was populated by individuals who were promoted for reasons related to their expertise, to their education, etc. But that expertise and that education was closely associated with the dominant class's own institutions, those which socialized the members of the dominant class into their ruling role. That was the essence of the theorization of the book, and it was extended to the judiciary, to the media, what he called the agents of legitimation, and so forth. In saying this, although he didn't develop the term originally, Nikos Poulantzas, the great Greek-French theorist, did. Milliband was articulating an understanding of what later came to be called, and Milliband himself would often use the term, the relative autonomy of the capitalist state. He preferred a state in capitalist society rather than a capitalist state as a way to think about this, because it gave you a better set of framework for appreciating that relative autonomy. The state had its own institutional purpose, its own institutional matrix, and yet by virtue of the linkages between state personnel and the dominant class, by virtue of the dependence of state personnel on successful capital accumulation for their own tax base and their own legitimacy. If you have high unemployment, then the state personnel, whether elected or unelected, lose their legitimacy. By virtue of those things, the state was only relatively autonomous from capital. Milliband would enter into debates with Poulantzas over how to conceptualize this. In the end, they both, I think the tendency to draw too sharp distinctions between them, which I came to the conclusion in the 70s was largely a product of American PhD students in sociology preparing for their comprehensive exams by drawing the types of polarities between theorists, which go down very well on the part of intellectual mentors. In fact, Poulantzas and Milliband were engaged, I think, in the same project and were arriving at much the same conclusions, whatever the heat of the debate amongst them at some points. And it was the point of the exercise was to assess in different states and in different conjunctures the limits beyond which reform could not go before it would induce a crisis of confidence and a crisis of accumulation. They then, in order to get beyond that, you had to look at Poulantzas's, but I would argue especially Miliband's work, in terms of socialist strategy, in terms of the development of adequate socialist institutions outside the state, which aim to enter the state, which would be able to negotiate, move beyond those limits. And that's what I want to turn to in the time I've got left to me. How much time do I have left, Bhaskar?
You can keep going. I see no discontent in the chat. So I think, why don't you take 12 minutes to wrap up? Does that
Good,
make
that's
sense?
perfect.
Yep.
That's perfect. Miliband was probably the most consistent student through the second half of the 20th century of working class parties who took it as their objective to enter the state. And he was their most persistent critic. His first great book was Parliamentary Socialism, published in 1960. It came at a moment, just 3 years after the emergence, 4 years after the emergence in Britain of what came to be known as the New Left, composed of an older generation of Marxist intellectuals and activists who broke with the communist parties in the wake of the Khrushchev revelations of Stalinism, and were joined by many of those who had left earlier than that in the wake of Stalinism. They founded a journal called The New Reasoner. Miliband very quickly joined it, but he was the only one of them. E.P. Thompson, John Saville, Doris Lessing, etc., who had never been a member of a communist party. A year later, a group of brilliant young Oxford and Cambridge intellectuals founded a journal called Universities and Left Review, with a similar objective to the New Reasoner, which was to develop a non-Stalinist political intellectual tradition, a non-dogmatic, non-Stalinist, inventive intellectual tradition. Miliband once described the difference between those two groups as the former group, the New Reasoner group, being intellectuals of the class, and the Universities and Left intellectuals types, this is Stuart Holland, Perry Anderson, etc., being intellectuals for the class. They joined together to form New Left Review. And Miliband was very worried about whether the two cultures would subsist well together, and they didn't. For the reason that Miliband had largely identified. And it was out of that division that Miliband, while remaining very close to the founders of New Left Review, went on to found in 1964 the Socialist Register, an annual survey of movements and ideas, which was less impressed by and interested in continental social and philosophical theory, and more interested in developing a fertile new Marxism that could make linkages through socialist education with working class activists, and therefore required to be less abstract, more concrete conceptually, etc. His Parliamentary Socialism was one of the few great books of that British New Left, preceding by 3 years Thomson's great Making of the English Working Class. And what it was a history of the British Labour Party. But it had a relevance and a reverberation that took it well, well beyond Britain. The opening sentence of Parliamentary Socialism is that of all the parties that take socialism as their objective, the British Labour Party has always been the most dogmatic. Not about socialism, but about parliamentarism. And the thrust of the book, as it looks through the history of the Labour Party, is to make the point that the Labour Party's primary commitment as a class party oriented to representing working class people was to achieve reforms for them through a commitment to the parliamentary mode of representation above all. That very commitment, which was greater than their commitment to socialism, meant that they weren't able to combine their ambitions for social reform with the type of socialist education and socialist mobilization that was necessary to be able to carry social reforms beyond the limits of a capitalist state. By the time, this was an old story in the Labor Party. The Labor Party was not admitted into the Second International of mass socialist parties because it explicitly at that point in time did not accept the concept of class struggle. And Lenin in particular vetoed admitting the Labor Party to the Socialist International for that very reason. The Labor Party was imbued with the Fabian goal of educating the ruling class to socialism, of articulating a politics through representing working class people at the level of parliament, a politics of achieving class harmony, whereby those who previously were excluded from the gentleman's club of parliamentary representation, once working men and then women finally won the vote, you would be able to achieve class harmony in the name of social reform by educating the ruling class to socialism. By the time the book was published, all of those mass social democratic parties were every bit as enveloped in the parliamentary reform, the parliamentary system, the electoral system, the mode of representation of their particular capitalist states as was the Labor Party. And indeed, ironically, the Labor Party, which in 1918, which until that point as a representative of trade unions getting elected into the British House of Commons, had not been socialist. It had adopted in 1918 a commitment to the democratic ownership of the means of production, distribution, and control. The great German Social Democratic Party, by the time Miliband's book was published, had abandoned its commitment to socialism and its commitment to class struggle. All of the social democratic parties by that point had adopted the notion that we work together within the existing system of representation with representatives of the bourgeois parties to arrive at reforms to the system as we can. So the relevance of the book, even though it was a history of the Labor Party, was very great, and it was read very, very broadly in social democratic parties at the time. To people who see young social democrats today, look back at that period as the heyday of socialism, this is often an ironic thing to observe. An elitist theory of democracy is what governed or explained the parliamentary mode of representation and the Labor Party's commitment to it. It was precisely Britain's long tradition of parliamentary representation that established that once you got democracy, it was extremely important that the representatives of those who had previously been excluded from the vote should not exercise control over the people who were elected. That if you had activist socialists of those types who were most active in socialist parties, being able to exercise control over those who got elected, they would be responsible to those socialist activists rather than to the national interest as arrived in rational debate amongst parliamentary elites. The consequence of this was that while these parties remained class parties, they remained dependent on union funding in order to compete in elections. They remained dependent on working class votes primarily to get elected. Nevertheless, they increasingly became insulated from the mass parties. And these were parties, after all, which hadn't been created, as were the bourgeois parties, the conservative parties, the liberal parties, hadn't been created outside of Parliament in order to get people to vote for the representatives that had already been there in the pre-democratic era. These were mass parties that had grown outside of Parliament, of working people who had formed around the same time that mass unions were forming. And they established that their organizational sovereignty was based in the party conference, not in the people who were elected to Parliament. But what had happened by this point of time, and in the British Labour Party, it was pretty well there from the beginning, was that the parliamentary elite refused to take instructions from the party conference, from the party program, from party resolutions at party conference, etc. And Miliband went further and pointed out that while those few socialists, people who were committed to not only entering the state, but mobilizing people behind reforms that would not simply gradually automatically lead to socialism, but would be of a kind that would open more and more space for new struggles that would lead on to structural reforms that would eventually take capital away from capital and remove those aspects of the state that were inherently capitalist and tied to capitalism. Those socialists who did get into office and were uncomfortable with the gentleman's club that is a parliament, that is the modern legislature, well, they would be extremely uncomfortable with this. Nevertheless, they took the view very largely that you could solve the problem by passing resolutions at party conferences that you would hope would be enough to convince the parliamentarians to follow what the activist socialists in the party wanted, and they were constantly disappointed. The implicit message in parliamentary socialism, which Milliband would articulate consistently through his subsequent work, and most importantly, I think, in a book that Bhaskar mentioned at the outset, and I think his best book, which is Marxism and Politics, was that the distinction between reform and revolution is misleading. It's not misleading if you simply think of reformism as a notion that you will elect people into government. They will introduce reforms, and those reforms will accumulate to one another until suddenly you're in socialism without anybody noticing. That was reformism, and it was explicitly non-revolutionary, in Miliband's understanding, fundamentally misleading and mistaken. But the distinction between reform and revolution, he argued, was really a distinction between reform of a transformative kind and insurrection. And Miliband, who was never a Leninist, as he once put it, there's more than a hyphen between Marxism and Leninism, took the view that Lenin himself was very close to Kautsky. He pointed this out in Marxism and Politics long before Lars Lee wrote his great book on Lenin showing this. But that also the insurrectionary strategy which Lenin evolved and which he then justified and articulated in his later writings was indeed very specific to a state in which democratic transformative politics, electoral and mass mobilizing, were not possible. His critique of those people who look to insurrectionary politics, people out of the 60s who looked to, after the failures of the communist parties, who looked to found a better Leninism in Trotskyist parties. His critique of them was that they weren't sectarians because of something was wrong with their toilet training, but it was rather because they were trapped in a Bolshevik model, in the language of a Bolshevik model, in the strategic conception of a Bolshevik model, which was arcane in the context of the second half of the 20th century, where electoral politics was possible, was still meaningful, and where open mobilizing and socialist discussion and debate could take place. And it was their inability, therefore, using a Bolshevik conceptual framework to be relevant to most people in the era in which they were trying to develop new parties. It was that made them sectarian. Miliband's argument was that it was possible and necessary to evolve new mass parties successive to the social democratic parties and communist parties, which would undertake a politics of entering the state, but would not limit themselves to parliamentary representation, would indeed try to evolve social reforms, but in trying to develop those reforms so they could go further to be the basis of changing the apparatus of the state so that it was not reproducing capitalist social relations and its dependence on accumulation, and changing the way in which the capitalist state was articulated with, deeply intertwined with the dominant class in each society, that this would require an orientation to continuing socialist mobilization and mass education, even when you were in the state. One of his most telling observations about the early Labor Party politicians is how embarrassed they were by the militancy of the suffragettes. It wasn't that they didn't sympathize with the suffragette cause, with the struggle of the right to women to vote, but the very thought that they might be chaining themselves to the gates outside Parliament. This was the type of behavior that embarrassed them no end in the aristocratic context of representative politics. He was devoted from the mid-1960s on to the task of trying to found such new mass parties. For a short period, he thought it might be possible that Euro-communist parties in France and Italy might be able to evolve in that direction. He concluded increasingly that that was unlikely. But the project he set himself at that time of trying to foster a theoretical orientation and a strategical orientation to developing such mass parties, he always saw as a multi-generational task. This was not something that was going to be achieved within the framework of a generation or two. And therefore, what was required was mass socialist education, and he was constantly involved in educational societies involving working class people, linking up with socialists inside social democratic and communist parties to that end, opposing sectarianism, trying to articulate why it was that while the Marxist tradition was indispensable, there were elements of the Leninist tradition, which in terms of their articulation, not just Stalinist, of party structure, democratic centralism, etc., got in the way of developing the capacities of the very people you needed at the mass level to be able to run a democratic socialist state and society. Because he took institutions seriously, I'll just end with this. He took seriously the need for a socialist society, which he understood as public ownership of the fundamental means of production, to be one made up of administrative pluralism. And he said that had certain parallels with the Leninist theory of dual power. But what it required was expanding the arenas of self-government beyond those that already existed in the states, such as local and municipal and regional government, federal government, to other arenas of self-government, from industrial democracy inside the publicly owned industries, to cooperatives, to community organizations, which would ensure that the centralization of power in the state, in the context of taking capital away from capital, would not lead to a totalitarian monism. In that sense, Miliband, like his teacher Lasky, was profoundly respectful of the liberal tradition. And one of the main messages of all of his work is a warning against authoritarian capitalism. An argument that for space for socialism to exist, one needs liberal freedoms of speech and organization. And he was equally concerned, therefore, that insofar as socializing the means of production, communication, distribution, exchange, did involve the prospect of centralizing class power, it was incumbent upon socialists to ensure a type of pluralism, democratic pluralism, and a defense of the state's capacity to protect the freedom of speech and association that was so necessary to have a democratic socialism. And I'll just end with one comment he once made to me that I thought was both insightful and amusing in this respect. He had just come back from a speaking trip to Russia. This was at some point in the early 70s when I would drop in on his office and he would take me out to the Strand to have a smoke. And we'd be sitting there drinking coffee and he'd be telling me not to tell his wife that he's smoking because he'd already had a heart attack even as a young man before he was 50. And we started talking about the trip and he suddenly said, "Do you know why there are no cafes in Russia?" And I said, "Well, economic planning, of course." He said, "Don't be ridiculous, Leo. Cafes are where revolutions are hatched." I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Leo. That was great. And just as a reminder to everyone watching, actually, we have a lot of questions. I'm not sure we could take many more. I'll have to go through what we have now. But please do press like and press subscribe, whether you're watching this live or you're watching this in the months and years to come. There's not too many of these videos on YouTube because YouTube is a den of reaction and just weirdness. So this might be weird talking about Marxism in 2020, but certainly less weird than talking about Marxism in 2014 and 2015 was. So we're making some progress. Okay, so I will get to some of these questions. I'm just scrolling through now. All right, there's one that came in just now. How can we understand the politics and political economy of austerity today in an era of central bank stimulus and low interest rates? Has this changed the terrain of struggles within the state? I'll let you start with that one if you want to address that.
Well, for the moment, the politics of austerity, of course, is not being practiced. The question will be, as was the case after the massive 2009 stimulus in the United States, the biggest in peacetime history, and the even more massive fiscal stimulus by the Chinese state in 2009, whether there will be a return to austerity in the wake of this pandemic. One has to say that because this is taking place in every state, not only in the United States, the type of freedom the United States has to get away with having a massive deficit and not having a run on its currency, which is always the basis for the financiers' discipline over what governments spend, how much they spend, what they spend it on, etc. Because this is being encouraged so much around the world, it is conceivable that there will be more room for maneuver in other states, not only in the United States, should there be a commitment to sustaining a politics that breaks away from capitalist austerity. We'll have to see in that respect. It really depends on whether the bonds that are now being issued, which are essentially a means of central banks taking over assets that wouldn't be worth anything in this context and handing out money for them, encouraging banks to lend in that context, etc., will be able to be sustained even in the United States. There's every good reason for sustaining it, insofar as we can see in this incredible crisis that what do property owners, not only capitalists, but even the people who own union pension funds, what do they scramble for? At the moment of the crisis, they want to get hold of American dollars. It is the American Treasury bill, the American Federal Reserve, the American dollar is the realm of safety for all of finance in the world. That gives the United States a degree of maneuver that no other state has, and it means the other states are dependent to a certain extent on what the United States, above all the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, do. So the answer to your question is it depends, obviously. And it is certainly the case that the balance of forces politically, even after Sanders not winning the nomination, and in any case, he would have been constrained by the balance of forces in the Democratic Party and in Congress, even had he won. But it is conceivable that the sheer rationality of the case for universal public health care, regardless about all the screaming about the price tag, what a joke in light of what is now being spent, will make it possible to win that type of reform in the wake of this crisis. It's possible that given the obviously central logistic role, not only of banking, but also of distribution firms like Amazon in the context of this crisis, that the Democratic Socialist left can go much further than it has to this point in making a case for turning the banks into public utilities and for making the case for bringing Amazon into the post office rather than turning the post office over to Amazon. But this really depends on the balance of forces, ideological and political, within each particular country, and the United States in particular.
So we don't have a lot of time. So let me just get to maybe two questions. One, well, there's a few questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to address this. You already addressed it a bit in your talk about the affinities between the work of Miliband and Pallantis. There's one question in particular about the programmatic, I guess, view that Milliband developed of democratic socialism, the one developed by Pallantis in the last chapter of his book. Are there any relevant differences in what vision of a socialism that they had. I would imagine, even though there's a lot of relevant differences in their state theory, in terms of their vision, they were pretty much in sync. But I'll let you maybe take either aspects of that: theoretical differences or programmatic political differences.
There are theoretical differences in that, as I said before, Poulantzas's theorization of the state is one founded on a conception of class forces operating on the terrain of the state. Milliband is looking much more at the autonomy of state institutions and the way they are linked to dominant classes that form in partnership with the state and outside of them. That's the primary difference, I think. In terms of where they end up in terms of socialist strategy, if you read the last chapter of Poulantzas's State Power Socialism, which rejects the Leninist conception of dual power, rejects the notion of you smash the existing state and replace it with a set of pre-existing working class institutions. And he was of course, pilloried by many dogmatic Marxists and Leninists for coming to that conclusion. You can see that where he is directing himself is where Miliband has always been in terms of socialist strategy. He articulates that in some ways, I think, better than Milliband theoretically, but he also doesn't get very far, unfortunately, in trying to, and Milliband didn't go nearly enough far in this direction either, in trying to think through how the apparatuses of the existing state would need to be changed. That, of course, is a task that requires you, because of the institutional specificity of these apparatuses, to know a lot about them and to be able to think through how they could be changed, whether it's central banks, whether it's Department of Labor, whether it's a social service ministry, whether it's a hospital. So both of them, left enormous amounts of work to be done. But I think both of them were on the same page in this respect.
Yeah, and I think this is where a lot of our work needs to focus, especially now, on giving people a detailed look at what socialism could look like. Obviously we've been fitting in with the mantra of the old Marx, not wanting to write cookshops, recipes for the cookshops of the future. But I think nowadays so many people question not only whether socialism is politically possible, but whether it's technically possible. And Sam Gindin, in a recent piece in Catalyst, and some other work he's been working on in particular, I think has taken steps thinking in that direction, which is certainly worthwhile. There's a question from Paul, which is, I think the Sanders movement has praised social democracy so much because it still represents some kind of horizon that feels realistic while still ambitious in the US context. Is this an issue? So is it a problem that so many of our immediate demands are essentially just social democratic demands, and phrasing anything, articulating anything more radical than that seems to be a leap?
No and yes. I mean, it's not a problem. Insofar as the demand for universal health care, for example, for free public education, and so forth, can be and were social democratic demands. It is a problem insofar as one doesn't recognize that while we have Medicare in Canada, they have it in Germany and Sweden, and this is an important legacy of a time when the balance of social forces yielded certain reforms. Those reforms were constrained at the time and are even more constrained today by the marketization of so much of the state, by the introduction of competition into the state, by the use of low-paid, unorganized, often migrant labor in those very social institutions that are paid for by the state, and therefore are part of what your previous questioner was asking about in terms of permanent austerity. In other words, we need to be able to build on those reforms now, as the Social Democrats were not able to do, and most of their leadership were not willing to do, in a way that they don't become contained by, constrained by, and compromised by coexistence with a capitalist state that is dependent on private accumulation and on the reproduction of existing class relations. What happened even in Sweden, which had the first great financial crisis from financial deregulation, was precisely that, even in Sweden, right? But that's not to say that one shouldn't be trying to win those kinds of reforms. One needs to try to think through how to win them in a way that challenges the deeply authoritarian management structure of public hospitals. And when people say we need a map for socialism, all too often we get that in terms of we will take this or that sector of capital into public ownership, right? We will democratize as far as we can the enterprises. We will have productive co-ops where we can. But virtually none of those mappings think about how do we change those public apparatuses so they facilitate democracy within them and facilitate those reforms going beyond winning public health care to taking pharmacare into the public sector and turning pharmacare into something that is subject to democratic planning. In other words, we need to be thinking about how to change the state, not simply how to socialize what is now outside of it.
All right. Well, thank you, Leo. That was great. I actually didn't do my usual plug. We're doing these series almost every day at 6 p.m. Eastern. Tomorrow we have Oscar Taylor, who's going to do a talk on why democracy needs socialism. We have a bunch of other great material, coming up. I think this week alone, we have Oscar, we have Adonar Usmani on the economic roots of mass incarceration. We have Marcus Barnett on the politics of Tony Benn and the labor left, a tradition that Leo is very familiar with. Then on May Day, we have Matt Chrisman from Chapo Trap House and Connor Kilpatrick to do a little May Day show. I have no idea what they're going to talk about. It's kind of worrying me, but it should be very good. And then obviously on Saturday, we have another episode of Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. There's a Miliband quote. I actually don't quite remember it, but it goes something like, don't compare text with text, compare text with reality. And it's similar almost to Joan Robinson's quote about having Marx in her bones and not in her mouth, and many other great socialist intellectuals in the 20th century who were all in that spirit. In the 21st century, we have Leo Panitch in that spirit. So please do check out his work. Please read Socialist Register. And please tune in tomorrow at 6 p.m. for another edition of Stay at Home. But thank you, Leo. I really appreciate you.
Bashkar, can I give you one more quote since you're quoting?
Sure. Please.
Harold Lasky, Milliband's mentor, used to tell his friends this, that the conversion, you'll especially appreciate this given what you've just gone through in the Democratic Party, and people in Britain will appreciate it with what they've just gone through with Corbyn and the leaked report on the opposition to him. Lasky, who was the chairman of the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party, used to tell his friends that the conversion of the majority of the electorate to the support of fundamental social change would be a relatively easy task compared to the task of converting to socialism many of the Labour Party's leaders.
Yes, I think that's true of the new Labour Party leadership. At least it will forever be true, I think, of the leadership of the Democratic Party, barring Bernie Sanders finding the fountain of youth. But we'll see as we struggle forward. But thanks a lot, Leo.
Long Bhaskar. Thanks for doing
Okay.
this. Bye.